Finally landing the job of her dreams, Helen was excited to go to work every day. At least that's the way it was in the beginning. She liked her co-workers, and her direct supervisor was more like a mentor than a boss. After a few months, though, she noticed some accounting discrepancies. So she told one of her co-workers, who looked at the accounts in question, and she was told not to worry about those anymore. Someone else was supposed to deal with those. So she went on and joined her job, and then it happened again. She was again directed not to talk about it. Another employee came to her and said, you know, people who know how to get along here and understand the way things work get along just fine. But those people who try to make trouble and report problems lose their jobs. Although some may believe that peer pressure ends when a person becomes an adult, we know that that is unfortunately not the case. Adults are just as subject to peer pressure as are young people, children, youth. Peer pressure occurs when an individual or a group of people attempts to cause another person to conform to some type of uniform code. Now, this can happen when an individual is asked to do a normal work procedure at the office, or a normal work procedure that's slightly illegal. This can also happen when friends and family members encourage you to stop smoking because it's a healthy thing to do. So peer pressure can have some positive as well as negative consequences. According to health psychologist Dr. Shaileg Mirgain, pressure from peers might cause us to feel like we have to keep up with the Joneses, pressured into a lifestyle that isn't authentically ours, or leading us to strive for success that is someone else's definition. We all have a strong desire to feel like we belong. So we are all prone to being influenced by family and friends and coworkers and other people with whom we come into contact in our social groups. Peer pressure is unbelievably and undeniably strong. It's also one of the most powerful tools that advertisers have in their arsenal. I personally think that our culture discourages independent thinking because of consumerism and commercialism. Advertisers like to group us all together and create needs and create products to fill those needs, so that we can be happy and successful. Advertisers and TV programs promote an idea of what it means to be normal, what we should look like, what we should drive, and what we should put in and on our bodies. Family members pressure us about relationships. Friends try to convince us to change our style. Co-workers set the norms at the office, and every aspect of our life can be controlled by some sort of peer pressure. There have been a multitude of psychological studies that have revealed the power that people have over each other. I'd like to highlight two of those. Psychologist Dr. Ruth Berenda and her associates once carried out an interesting experiment with adolescents, teenagers, designed to show how a person handled group pressure. The plan was very simple. 10 adolescents would be brought into a room for a test. The students were instructed to raise their hand when the teacher pointed to the longest line on the chart. Now, what one person out of those 10 did not know was that the other 9 had been instructed before the experiment to pick the second longest line, not the longest line. So, time after time, the same thing would happen. The teacher would step up to a chart and point to a line and ask them to vote. And invariably, the 9 students who were instructed would pick the second longest line as the longest line. The 10th student who didn't know that this was happening, that was being kind of set up, would look around in confusion and eventually slip his or her hand up just to go along with the crowd. This remarkable conformity occurred in about 75% of the cases. And it was true of small children as well as high school children. So, that's just kids. Surely adults aren't prone to that kind of power. In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a Yale University professor, began a series of social psychology experiments to test the obedience to authority figures. So the Milgram study measured the willingness of a diverse group of adult men to obey an authority figure who asked them to do a task that conflicted with their personal conscience. Participants were told that they were helping out in a different experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to another person in another room. The fake electric shocks gradually increased in levels that would have been fatal if they had been real. And unexpectedly, unbelievably, the experiment discovered that a very high proportion of adult men would fully obey the instructions to shock a person, although they were uncomfortable doing so. Now this test has been, this is kind of a famous test, and it's been replicated across the globe over several decades with similar results. So I think a couple of things have happened in our culture because of adult peer pressure. First of all, I think for many people, adult peer pressure creates people-pleasing behavior. People pleasers set aside their own opinions, their own beliefs and needs in the pursuit of pleasing others and winning their approval. People pleasers pretend to agree with those around them, find it very difficult, if not impossible, to say no, and they feel responsible for how others feel. People pleasers don't tell others how they really feel. Now, my oldest son, Chad, has struggled with this demon of being a people pleaser for a great deal of his life. In a phone conversation that we had recently, he shared his joy at feeling like he's finally overcoming the lifelong tendency to please everyone around him. And today he feels like he is finally allowed to make some choices based on his own needs and his own desires, instead of making sure that everyone else is okay. But my favorite story about him in his frantic people-pleasing occurred on the evening before his wedding 2 years ago. He called me, we were out of town, out of state, and he asked if I wanted to come up to his hotel room and see him for a little bit. Well, I figured he wanted one more chance to practice our mother-son dance because we were a little clumsy. And so I thought, well, it's kind of late, but we'll practice again. So I got up to his room and he said, no, I want you to sit on the couch with me. I need to talk about some things. I'm a little worried about tomorrow. And I thought, oh no, he's having second thoughts. He doesn't want to do this. And he said, no, I don't know how I'm going to take care of everybody tomorrow. And I took him by both of his hands and I said, that is not your job, my son. All you need to worry about tomorrow is yourself and your bride. It is your day. It is your wedding day. I'd like to rent a billboard across the nation and write that for everybody to read. You do not need to take care of everyone. It's not your job. I love the study of human development. I love observing children with the understanding that whatever behavior they're doing at a particular point is about the developmental stage of their life. And I think we all have an understanding in our culture that children grow up mimicking their parents or their guardians, and in thought and in deed, and until eventually they separate from the thoughts and the deeds of their parents or guardians, and they take on their own individuality. But you and I both know that sometimes that doesn't happen. There are lots of adults walking around who've not yet made that leap into their own individuality. I once taught high school with a teacher who was absolutely miserable. She was an exact duplicate of her mother. She had denied all of her own desires and needs, and instead she had adopted her mother's life. She attended her mother's church, she voted like her mother, and she decorated her apartment like her mother would want her to. She was 45 years old, and she had completely ignored her own identity in deference to pleasing her mother. She confided to me that while she loved her mother, she didn't like her mother's decorating style. She didn't want to vote like her mother. She didn't even agree with that. And she didn't like the church that they all went to because she didn't agree with their beliefs. But she didn't feel strong enough to stand up for what she believed. So what about us? Yes, we share DNA with our parents, and we love them. But we don't have to believe and behave as they did. I'm concerned, gravely concerned, about adult peer pressure because of the impact it has on our spiritual journey. I don't know how people who spend their lives pleasing others or following the crowd are able to develop their own spirituality. Part of the reason that people are attracted to religious organizations is so that they can examine and confront what they believe. And we all know that organized religion is often viewed negatively because of the dogma and the structure that it presents. In many churches, people are not encouraged to be responsible for their own spiritual journey or to think about what they believe. And to me, that is one of the finest attributes of this faith community. Entry Point doesn't want you to follow the crowd. We want you to be independent. We want you to examine what you believe and be responsible for your own spiritual place in this world. Now, if you find yourself struggling with peer pressures, try to surround yourself with people who affirm you and your choices. Find ways to validate yourself. Try to be more assertive. Practice saying no. You have that right. Spend more time getting acquainted with who you are and figure out what you believe. What do you believe? My youngest son, Luke, has always been, he's the opposite of Chad. He's always been independent and very sure of himself. When he was just 5 years old and he was in kindergarten, his teacher once told Marcy and me that he had stood his ground against the entire kindergarten class when making a prediction for a science experiment. The teacher had asked the class this question: will soap bubbles dissolve faster in cold water or in hot water? So the teacher went around and asked every child his or her answer. Every child voted, and every child except Luke said soap bubbles will dissolve faster in hot water. The teacher then went to Luke and said, well, everyone else is saying this other thing. Do you want to change your vote? No. He said, I'm going to hold fast to my answer. Cold water will dissolve the soap bubbles faster. He was the only student who was right. Be like Luke. Resist following the crowd. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. You have the right to be yourself. So stand strong. Be braver. Be true to yourself. You've got it in you. You got this. Amen. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." It's time to own yourself. Don't cave in to peer pressure, no matter how old you are. Be yourself. You got this. Amen. Have a great Sunday and go in peace.